For over 100 years, the Gilgamesh Confederation and the Balarant Union were at war with each other in the Astragalus galaxy. The cause of the war has long been forgotten, and both sides continued to fight, primarily by utilizing advanced military weapons known as armored troopers, or Votoms, which stands for Vertical One-Man Tank for Offense and Maneuvers. The story of Votoms begins near the end of the war. Kiriko Kuvi, a Gilgamesh soldier and former member of the infamous Red Shoulder Battalion, was suddenly transferred to a unit engaged in a secret mission. During the mission, Kiriko realizes that the unit was trying to steal secrets from his own side, and they ultimately betray him and left him to die in the vacuum of space. The Gilgamesh eventually discovers him alive and arrested him as a traitor, torturing him for information on their home world. Kiriko eventually escapes from his prison, triggering a hunt that lasts throughout the entire series. While the century-long war may be over, Kiriko's own personal war was just beginning, as he now tries to track down the unit that betrayed him and uncover the secrets behind the operation. One of the secrets being a mysterious and beautiful woman that Kiriko encountered during the operation, who would become the key to unravel the galactic conspiracy. Armored Trooper Votoms is one of the forefathers of real robot anime, and the brainchild of Sunrise director Ryosuke Takahashi, who previously directed Fang of the Sun Dugrum, and would go on to direct Panzerworld Gallant, SBT Leisner, and was even the producer for Gal Gaigar. Now, even though Votoms was made during a time when the real robot genre was just starting to establish itself, it was already introducing new ideas and concepts. Unlike Gundam or Dugrum, where the story primarily takes place during a full-scale war, Votoms takes place directly after one, and so we get to see the kinds of effects the war had on the galaxy. Toxic rain pouring down on certain planets, entire cities have been destroyed, and civil disorder continues to happen. Most of the details about the war remain largely a mystery throughout the majority of the series. In fact, much of the Astragalus galaxy itself is a mystery. Did the settlers here come all the way from Earth? Or are they natives to the galaxy? Why did the Balarant and Gilgamesh go to war with each other for so long? How damaging was the war to the planets that were caught in it? Much of this can be left to interpretation, which I personally like because it makes for interesting topics to discuss for years to come. The main story is divided into 4 arcs, each with its own setting and subject to tackle, and I found each arc to be enjoyable in their own way. If I had to pick one I liked the least, it would honestly be the very first arc in, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced this, Udo City. Not saying it's bad, it does a good job setting up the rest of the story, but I did find its pacing to be kinda slow, and the arcs that came after it were just much more enjoyable. The pacing in general is pretty decent, with only a few recap episodes in between, which can be easily skipped. The series also has a heavy anti-war message throughout, and showcases the horrors of war in a pretty dark and brutal fashion, in some cases more so than even Gundam did. Hell, the second arc in the series feels like it was based on the Vietnam War, which is a pretty dark subject matter in its own right. Moving on to the characters, I really like Kiriko as a whole. He was a very different protagonist compared to Amuro or Krin or Hikaru. He's already a well-trained soldier with incredible intelligence and a calm demeanor. Keep in mind, in the original series, Kiriko was only around 18 years old, which I still find very hard to believe considering how mature he is. Now, Kiriko primarily struggles with psychological issues caused by his terrifying past as a Red Shoulder, and throughout the series, he ultimately tries to atone for the sins he committed during the war. I almost want to say that it's similar to how soldiers suffer from PTSD after returning home from a war, and maybe that is what they were going for with Kiriko, but I'm not entirely sure. Overall though, I thought Kiriko was a damn good protagonist, and it was clear that others felt the same way, as quite a bit of shows after Votoms would have a protagonist that tends to be a silent, stoic soldier like Kiriko was, but I don't think any of them ever came close to being as well written. The rest of the cast is pretty good in their own right, and they ultimately manage to impact Kiriko's character in one way or another. The trio of Gotho, Vanilla, and Kokona, I think that's how you pronounce her name, tended to be quite loud and obnoxious, but they do have a sense of morality and are simply trying their best to survive a galaxy that suffered nearly a century of war. And I really loved how they remained incredibly loyal to Kiriko no matter how bad the situation got. Rochina was an interesting character. I really like the whole double agent aspect about him, and he just comes off as mysterious and conniving. Not to mention he has a huge obsession with Kiriko throughout the series. Fiona, if you haven't guessed by now, is the girl Kiriko sees in the beginning of the series, and plays a very important role in the story. Oh, and she's also his love interest, which isn't much of a spoiler by the way, since even I saw it coming from a mile away. That being said, I loved what they did with her character. She was originally created with the sole purpose of being a killing machine on the battlefield, but ultimately becomes the most empathetic character in the whole series. The Secret Society makes for some really great villains, and the main antagonist himself is one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen in a mecha series from this time period. Speaking of bizarre, that was also how I felt about the finale to the show, which I refuse to spoil since it's one of the most shocking yet clever endings I've seen in an anime. Overall, I really dig Votoms for what it did. I found the cast memorable and the writing to be pretty damn good for the most part. Like many shows during this time period, the visuals are pretty outdated by today's standards, but for 1983, I think the show looks good. I thought the character designs done by the late Norio Shioyama were great, and I also enjoyed a variety of settings that range from a dark cyberpunk city, to a jungle, to a desert wasteland. Of course, no review on mecha anime is complete without discussing the mechs themselves, and this show probably has the most realistic portrayal of mechs at the time. Not saying that the shows before were not realistic, but when you look back at a show like Gundam, while many of the grunt suits were disposable, the Gundam and some of the Commander mobile suits were sturdier and are designed to be more appealing to a general audience. In contrast, the ATs and Votoms are essentially more versatile tanks. They are highly mobile and can equip loads of firepower, but tend to have fragile armor and are easily disposable. Another thing I noticed was that there are only a handful of customized ATs in the whole series, and they are shown to be no sturdier than the standard ATs, which I kind of liked. It allows for the battles to focus more on skill, at least until we got heavier into the PS stuff. The mech designs were done by Kunio Okawara, who has had a rich history of designing various mecha for Sunrise, and I thought all the designs were pretty cool looking, especially the iconic Scope Dog. The battles themselves are really good. They are fast-paced, explosive, and have very little stock footage from what I can recall, which is pretty impressive for a full-fledged anime in the 80s. All in all, I think Votoms looks really good when compared to some of the other anime during its time. The music by Hiroki Inui is absolutely outstanding, and fits perfectly with the harsh tone of the series. The opening is also legendary. Hono no Sadame is one of those songs that will get stuck in your head for a long time because of how catchy it is. The ending theme, Itsumo Anata ga, is a lot more mellow and soothing, and I find it rather charming. It's a fantastic soundtrack, and I definitely recommend checking it out. The voice acting is pretty solid throughout the show. Kiriko is voiced by Hozumi Goda, who also voiced Lyle Convoy in Beast Wars 2, as well as Leorio in the 1999 Hunter x Hunter anime. Fiona is voiced by the late Kazuko Yanaga. She didn't have a lot of notable roles in anime, but she did provide dubbing voices for famous American actresses like Sigourney Weaver and Jamie Lee Curtis. Veteran Seiyu Kosei Tomita voices Gotho, and he provided the voice for Dr. Hell in the original Mazinger, as well as Professor Saltome in the early Getter shows. We also have Shigeru Chiba as Vanilla, Banjo Ginga as Rochina, and Masashi Hirose as Kanyu. Believe it or not, the show did have a dub at one point made by Central Park Media. Yeah, the guys that dubbed Garzy's Wing. But don't worry, from what I saw of the Votoms dub, it was actually pretty decent. But it was very short-lived and very hard to find. One interesting thing to note about it was that it had Dan Green as Kiriko, which I find hard to believe how he would go from portraying a silent, stoic soldier to a charismatic teenager like Yugi. If you can find a way to watch the dub, I recommend watching it just for the novelty alone. Armored Trooper Votoms is still a damn good anime after all these years. It's no wonder why it still has quite a cult following. I love the hard science approach to the real robot genre, the story is unique and engaging, the characters are memorable, and the visuals and music are fantastic. The only real criticism I have with the show was that the pacing could have been a tad bit better, but the positives highly outweigh the negatives. Even though the show was ultimately overshadowed by Gundam, I still consider it a classic in the real robot genre, and I highly recommend anyone who is a fan of mecha anime to go see it. Much like Takahashi's previous work Dougram, Votoms was quite successful and ultimately spawned a series of OVAs that expanded and continued the story. Though as of this recording, it has been almost a decade since we last had any kind of animated Votoms media. Maybe someday the franchise can rise again, and when it does, expect Kiriko Kubi to kick some major ass. Final score, 9 out of 10.